One of my favorite things to do, one of my hobbies, is photography. I remember getting my first camera when I was in high school. It was a simple point-and-shoot camera, but I would go all over the house and particularly all over the backyard, taking pictures of everything that I could. What was exciting was it was a digital camera, so I didn't have to worry about only having 24 opportunities to get the right photo. I could take a countless number, as many as I wanted to, trying to get the right angle. That love has grown over the years, and as that has grown, so has my camera and its capabilities. But I remember finally making the decision to take the camera off of automatic mode and turning it on to manual. There's a dial on the top where you can switch it to that. There's usually a little M that will communicate that you're going into full control mode. And it was nerve-wracking at first, because the beauty of an automatic camera, of a point and shoot, is that the camera does all the thinking for you. It'll decide what needs to work inside to get the best picture. You might decide if you want to add flash or not to the scene that you're trying to capture, but the camera does all the work. But when you switch to manual mode, you are in full control. You need to decide everything that the camera does, but it gives a greater freedom in trying to capture the scene that you see in front of you. There are a lot of things to learn when you switch over to manual mode, but one of the things that I had to keep reminding myself was that I needed to set the focus, that the camera was no longer deciding for me what was most important to focus on. I had to tell the camera where to look and what to make sure came in with clarity and with detail. Now that was challenging for me because this camera that I had at the time I made the switch had 64 different points in its frame that you could tell it to choose to focus the image. So in trying to help myself learn this new way of using my camera, I used a mode in the camera called single point focus. So out of all 64 points, I would tell it, you focus on this one specific point. Now that was great training wheels because I love to take pictures of flowers, of nature, of landscapes, of things that really didn't go places. It would stay still so I could set the focus and just forget it and focus on everything else and all the other settings. This year, though, my new favorite subject to take photos of has been my daughter, and early on this single point kind of set it and forget it focusing mode was great because I could set Noelle down and she would just sleep. She didn't know how to roll over, she didn't know how to crawl, so I could kind of set her in her crib or on her activity mat on the floor, and she would stay in one place and I could worry about all the other settings. But since moving here, Noelle has found her legs and her arms and is now crawling all over the house. And so I am finding I need to keep shifting my focus, to keep resetting the point. I'm finding new ways to always make sure that she is staying in focus in the frame and I'm getting the picture that I'm looking for. Now, I bet you didn't expect to come here this morning and get a miniature photography lesson. So what does all of that have to do with church? In our passage this morning, Paul is talking a lot about focus. What is it that we focus on, especially as a church community? What is it that brings us together, and what is it that we are trying to do? Because life is difficult, and there's a lot of things that can compete for our attention. You think about anything that happens in a given week. Think of your average week. We kind of get into autopilot mode. You know, we make our schedule, we know where we're going to go, what we're going to do, have our shopping list meetings, and we kind of set it and forget it. But then that means we become, it's easy to get off track, to get pushed and pulled by any given situation that arises during the week. So what does it look like to focus and to keep our focus, not only when life is going well, but when life is going difficult? As Paul is writing to this early Christian community, this Ephesian church, he is praying for their focus. The passage that Graham read for us this morning, the second half of it in particular, is really a prayer. Now, prayer isn't an uncommon thing for Paul to do in his letters. In a lot of his other writings, he'll take time to give thanks to God for how God has been a refuge for him. He'll pause to give thanks for these early Christian communities. He'll name all of these other men and women who have been instrumental in the mission and in the life of the church. But what's different about this prayer to the Ephesian community is he goes beyond thanksgiving to praying for the community's strength and well-being. And specifically, he prays that this early church community will be rooted in God's love, not only so that they can begin to grasp this amazingness of God's love that has brought them all together, but so that they can be filled with that love in all areas of their lives. When you get into the wording here, it's truly beautiful how Paul talks about God's love, especially considering how much he wrote about God's love and what it is and what it means to him and to the church community and to the world. He takes a moment to be humble and saying, we can't ever fully understand God's love. It is beyond human comprehension. It is greater than our understanding. We will never fully have the words to capture or to describe this experience. And yet, he says, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean something to us. We can still feel that love, and we know how powerful it is. God's love can transform lives. God's love can transform the world. He says towards the end of his prayer that this love can accomplish things beyond our imagining. And for Paul, the church, these early community, these people who are seeking to follow Jesus' teachings in their lives, the church is one of the primary ways in which God's love is made known to the world. This love that is bigger than we can fully grasp becomes tangible as the church comes together to live life in worship, in mission, and in service. So when he prays in that prayer for this church to be rooted in love, it's another way for him to say, love is the goal of the church. It's not only what brings them together, but it's their mission and their focus, to experience that love and to share it out in the world around them. In praying for the church to be rooted in love, I think Paul is doing something really neat here. He's acknowledging that it's easy for us to not be rooted in love. You wouldn't pray for something that was a given, right? And so if we're praying to be rooted in love, I think that means that there's a chance and a risk that there can be other things in our lives that capture our focus or that we give our attention to. Things like fear. We could get caught up in trying to figure out, what's most important for me or what's going to benefit me in the long run. We can get caught up in bitterness or in anger, and all of these things can begin to shift our focus away from love. Now, life is difficult. We experience a lot of different hurts and disappointments that can begin to wear on us over time, that can change how we respond, and that can begin to take the focus away from love. And Paul knows this better than anybody else, because his ministry that he engages in as he goes out to the Gentiles to share God's love is one that is really difficult. As we know from other parts of the New Testament, Paul faced imprisonment. He was often arrested and spent long time in jail. He had a lot of physical ailments and setbacks. And I think Paul was also often ridiculed or criticized, because Paul went from somebody who persecuted the church to being its greatest advocate. So you can imagine as he would go to new communities that they would see him as his former self and not as the person who he was, rooted in God's love. All of these different experiences and interactions could have shifted his focus away from God's love. He could have become more concerned about his own survival or his health or his well-being. And yet he knew and kept centering himself in that love, kept choosing it over and over again as he engaged in his mission. What we choose to ground ourselves in, what we focus on, really does matter in how we live our life, especially in living a life of faith. Experiencing God's love changes our lives, and the more and more that we can center on that and experience that love, it gives us the energy to go on serving others with kindness and compassion and generosity, no matter what it is that comes to us through the midst of daily living. Church is the place where we come to experience and center on that love, so that when we go back out of these doors into the week, we have that energy and that focus to keep on loving when it's difficult. So everything that we do as a church, from worshiping together to fellowshipping together to serving in mission and being in small groups and gathering together for committee meetings, the individual interactions we have with each other, all of this is about God's love. And that is our focus and our highest goal. To be a community of love where we experience it, and to also be a community that goes out and models that love for the world around us. Earlier this year, I read a book that has really begun to change my thinking about what faith looks like in our world today and what the church's role is in that. It's a book called The Great Spiritual Migration by Brian McLaren. Early on in that book, he talks about this experience he had where after leaving the pastorate, he had served as a pastor for numerous years, he and his family moved to an entirely new town in an entirely new state. And it became quickly clear to him that for the first time in his life, he had a choice about whether or not he would go to church on Sunday. And he said specifically, nobody would know whether I went to church or I played hooky that morning. And so he really had to wrestle with, did he go to church because he felt a sense of duty or obligation about it? Or was there an actual need for church in his life that he needed? He found that he did have a need for church, but it was different than what he had focused on as a pastor. He didn't need a particular style of sermon or a certain type of worship or activities. He found, and I'm gonna quote him specifically, he needed a church that would help him live a life of love with as little distraction as possible. He writes, I needed sustenance, encouragement, and help in loving God, in loving myself, in loving my wife and my kids and my grandkids and my extended family. I needed help loving my neighbors, especially people I might struggle to love. I needed help in loving the earth. And I felt that without a community and regular gatherings to help me, I could too easily drift, too easily shift into autopilot, too easily stagnate and sour. Without intentional care and relevant practices, my soul could grow cold, could grow small and dark. He found he needed a community focused on love, because in the midst of life, in the midst of all of the challenges that we face in trying our best to love people, it's too easy for our focus to shift. He then goes on to pose a question. Where in our world today are the places teaching this way of love? Where are the places rooted in God's love? And if our churches aren't those places, then who is teaching this way of love in our world? Now, to be fair, there is a lot of talk about love in our culture. Anytime you like a photo on Instagram, you hit the heart, you send, I love this on social media. We see all kinds of cards and holidays and movies. But the love that Paul is talking about in this passage, the love of God, isn't just a sentimental feeling, something that we see on the Hallmark Channel. God's love is more than a feeling, more than something that makes us feel good. It is a real and powerful force in our lives. It's something that can bring about new life and new possibilities. This love can reconcile broken relationships. It can bring beauty out of the deepest wounds and brokenness that we feel in our own lives or see in the world around us. And God's love can bring about new life in ways we can't imagine. But that kind of love is difficult to practice. It takes a lot of focus and a lot of energy, and it's why we need to root ourselves in it, to choose every day to say, yes, I will choose love. I will do my best to practice it. And church helps us to do that. I spend a lot of time, particularly when officiating weddings, working with couples as they prepare for the ceremony, just to spend some time with them, to hear their stories of how they found each other, how they fell in love, how they knew that they were right for one another. And it's beautiful to hear all of the feelings of love that they have. But one thing that we talk about is that on the day of the wedding, they say, I do. They make a choice and a commitment. But it's also a choice that they have to make the next day, and the next day, and the next month, and the next year. And when the bills are high, and when the job changes, and when children may or may not come along, when life happens, love needs to continue to be a choice that they make, because it's too easy to shift our focus to something else. When we encounter hardships and challenges, not just in our own lives, but in the church, do we continue to choose love, to say yes over and over again to the power of God's love in our lives and in the world? I find in my own life, when these hard times come, this is when I need church the most, to help me to experience it and to help me to keep choosing to live it out. There's this pastor, she's of the Lutheran tradition, by the name of Nadia Bolz-Weber. She's a pastor of a church called the House for All Sinners and Saints. She talks about this quarterly gathering she has for members who are new to that church community. And they share about what drew them to the church. The people, the way they were welcomed when they came in, what they experienced in worship, something they heard in a small group. And they talk about all of the reasons that they love the church and why they're here. She shares with them a little bit of her own journey, but she always follows it up by telling them that that community will disappoint them. That there will come a time when they are participating there and they will be disappointed, let down by something stupid that is said or something that somebody does. And then she offers them an invitation. When that disappointment happens, will they decide to stick around after it happens? Because she fundamentally believes, and she tells them this, is that when they choose to stick around in the face of disappointment, that is when they get to see how the grace of God can come in and fill the holes left by the community's failure. And that is just too beautiful and real to miss out. Friends, hear me out for a second. This community will disappoint you at some point in time. There will be a time where I will disappoint you. But I hope when disappointments happen, whether it is here in this church or out in the world, that you will choose to stick around and to keep believing in the power of God's love. Because we as a church are going to do our best to love each other. I am going to do my best to keep on loving you, and that's what church is. We are an imperfect community made up of imperfect and broken people, but we are an imperfect community who believes in the power of God's love to do things beyond our own strength and beyond our imagining. And in our effort to love, in choosing to love even in the midst of brokenness and failure and stumblings, that's where we see God most powerfully at work and where God's grace shines so brightly. Can you imagine what it would look like in our world if we kept choosing to love in the face of disappointment? The way that we could model what it looks like to respond to disappointment with kindness and courage and generosity. Friends, let us be the church that roots ourselves in love. Find a spiritual practice, some way that you can keep plugging in and experiencing God's love. And when disappointments happen, when struggles come up, keep choosing love over and over again. It's greater than we are, and it can do amazing and tremendous things. Amen. Amen.